I never thought that ordinary noise could turn my life upside down. It started on a typical Tuesday, a day as grey and monotonous as any other. My husband was away on a business trip again, and I spent the morning in my usual chores, cleaning kitchen cabinets and lazily scrolling through social media. Outside, a light, steady rain was falling, creating a background that seemed perfect for reflecting on how boring and predictable my life had become. But around noon, that rhythm was disrupted. At first, it was like a whisper, a barely audible sound coming from the neighbouring house. I thought it might be the television. Mr. Graham often left it on. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder and seemed to transform, turning into a strange, steady hum. Something was wrong. Mr. Graham, my neighbour, was a man whose presence commanded respect. A widower who had lived in that house for many years, he exuded a calm that could be felt even across the fence separating our yards. His life was quiet and secluded. We exchanged polite greetings, but I never dared to go beyond superficial courtesy. His losses, his silence, his focus, all of it surrounded him with an impenetrable shield that none of the neighbours tried to break. But today, that shield seemed to crack. When I looked out the window to find the source of the noise, my heart skipped a beat. Mr. Graham's front door was slightly ajar. It was so unusual that for a moment I thought my eyes were deceiving me. He was always so meticulous, so precise. The door was never left unlocked, even when he stepped out for a few minutes. I felt a growing unease. Something inside told me this couldn't be ignored. The noise, now I realized it was the sound of running water, was getting louder. I slowly got up from the couch, my gaze still fixed on the half-open door. "Is everything okay?" I muttered to myself, as if trying to convince myself that nothing bad was happening. But instead of an answer, a heavy silence hung in the air. I went to the window, and at that moment, my heart beat faster. There was no movement in the house. Usually, Mr. Graham would periodically appear at the window, either with a book or a cup of coffee. But today the windows were empty, and the hum of the water grew more distinct. Gathering my courage, I threw on a jacket and stepped onto the porch. The cool rain touched my face, making me feel the sharpness of the moment. I crossed the wet path and stopped in front of his door. It was open just enough to see the dark hallway beyond. "Mr. Graham," I called, but my voice seemed to drown in the noise of the water. I knocked softly at first, then harder. No response. Inside me, the feeling grew that something had gone terribly wrong. I remembered the neighbour's stories about how he once fell in his garden and broke his arm. What if he had fallen again? What if he couldn't call for help? My hand trembled as I carefully pushed the door open. It creaked, revealing a path into the cool, dark house. I stepped inside, feeling fear slowly fill me. The living room was in perfect order, books on the shelves, an armchair by the window, a stack of newspapers on the table. Everything looked as if the owner could return at any moment, but the sound of water still flowing somewhere deep in the house filled the air with anxious tension. "Mr. Graham?" I called again, but only silence answered me. My heart was pounding so loudly that I could barely hear my own steps. As I ventured deeper into the house, I noticed a faint smell, damp, as if someone had been taking a long shower in the bathroom. The hallway led me to the source of the sound, and I stopped in front of the slightly open bathroom door. Steam poured out, thick and dense as if from a hot spring. I slowly touched the door, pushed it open a bit more, and froze, seeing a silhouette behind the glass partition of the shower stall. My breath caught, and goosebumps covered my skin. I wanted to turn and leave, but something held me in place. It wasn't just the fear of invading someone's privacy. It was something more, a feeling I couldn't explain. The silhouette slowly turned, and I saw Mr. Graham's eyes looking at me through the fogged glass. He didn't look frightened or angry. He looked at me calmly, as if he had been expecting my arrival. And then he smiled, a light, enigmatic smile that made me gasp. There was something wrong with that look, but at the same time, it drew me in like nothing ever had before. After I fled Mr. Graham's house, my heart continued to race for a long time. I rushed into my living room and slammed the door behind me, as if to block something unknown that might follow me. The rain outside intensified, beating against the window in rhythmic, almost hypnotic pulses. But my attention was not on the weather. The image of his calm eyes and light smile lingered in my mind. Why wasn't he surprised? Why didn't he say anything except for that strange, unperturbed smile? I tried to occupy myself with something, turned on the TV, picked up a book, even made myself a cup of tea. But my thoughts kept returning to Mr. Graham, to his house, to the sound of water that still echoed in my memory. I needed an explanation. I tried to convince myself that it could all be dismissed as an awkward moment, but inside me grew a feeling that it was something more. The next day I decided it would be best to forget what had happened and return to my usual life. But reality had other plans. In the morning I noticed him in the garden. He stood by the fence, calmly watching the birds as if nothing had happened. His presence was both soothing and unsettling. I tried to avoid his gaze, but he seemed to sense my presence. "Good morning," he said when our eyes finally met. His voice was steady, with no hint of irritation or irony. "Good morning," I replied, feeling my cheeks flush. I didn't know what to say next. He, too, didn't seem in a hurry to continue the conversation. A moment hung in the air before he added, "Thank you for stopping by yesterday." "I appreciate it." I froze. His words sounded sincere, but they only increased my confusion. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," I mumbled, avoiding his gaze. "Everything was fine," he said with a slight smile. But there was something in his tone that made me doubt. Was everything really okay? Why did the sound of water continue for so long? Why was his gaze so strange? All day I was lost in thought. There was nothing suspicious in his words, but the feeling that something was wrong kept gnawing at me. It was as if I had missed an important detail, the key to solving this puzzle. I tried to distract myself, but with each passing hour, the feeling only grew stronger. Something was pulling me back to his house, to him, to the secret hidden behind his calm smile. On the third day after the strange visit, I felt my willpower waning. The feeling that I was on the brink of something important wouldn't leave me. It seemed as if time itself had become thick and heavy, pulling me toward Mr. Graham. I found myself more and more often standing by the window watching his house. It wasn't an obsession, more a mix of concern and a strange, painful curiosity. By evening, I made up my mind. Telling myself it was just a polite gesture, I baked some cookies and wrapped them in a cloth. It was a simple pretext. I understood that, but I couldn't stop myself. My husband was still away on his business trip, and his absence more than ever underscored the emptiness of my home. When I knocked on Mr. Graham's door, it opened almost immediately. He stood in the doorway, his dark eyes looking at me with a hint of surprise, but no trace of reproach. "This is for you," I said, holding out the package of cookies. "I thought you might like something sweet." His lips curved into a barely noticeable smile. "That's very kind of you. Thank you, Ellison," he said, inviting me inside with a gesture. I entered, feeling strangely comfortable in his living room. Everything in this house seemed to reflect its owner, strict but warm. We talked a little, discussing the weather, his favourite books, my attempt to start gardening. But behind this lightness there was something more. I felt it in every glance, in every pause between words. When he offered me a cup of tea, I agreed. We sat in his living room, listening to the soft crackling of the fire in the fireplace. I noticed how his gaze lingered on my hands, on how I stirred the tea. This attention, gentle and unobtrusive, made me feel both embarrassed and desired. "You look lonely," he said suddenly, his voice soft, almost a whisper. His words caught me off guard. I looked at him, not knowing how to respond. I don't know," I mumbled, feeling my voice tremble. He leaned in a little closer and his eyes met mine. "I know what it's like to be alone," he said, and there was so much sadness in his voice that I couldn't look away. At that moment, I realized that something was happening between us that couldn't be explained in words. It was more than just a friendly conversation. It was the beginning of something inevitable that could no longer be stopped. When I woke up the next morning, the first rays of the sun barely pierced the heavy clouds, and my mind was in chaos. My home, my marriage, my years lived in this routine, suddenly seemed pale and distant. It felt as if my soul was on the brink, between fleeing my feelings and surrendering to them. My phone beeped. It was a message from my husband, short and emotionless, with another delay in his return. I looked at the screen, feeling the familiar emptiness fill me, and then, as if in response to that longing, I remembered Mr. Graham's gaze again. His eyes seemed to see something more in me than just a neighbour, and I couldn't shake that memory. By evening, I found myself at his door again. My hand trembled as I knocked. The door opened, and this time his smile was warmer. He stepped aside with a gesture, inviting me in, and I stepped inside. His house was filled with soft light, and the gentle crackling of the fireplace came from within. This place seemed like another world, calm and protected from everything. "I didn't think I'd be back here so soon," I said, trying to lighten the mood. My attempt to sound casual failed when my voice trembled. "And yet here you are," he said with a slight smile. "Did something happen?" I shook my head, trying to find the words. "No, nothing. I just wanted to thank you for that evening, and for listening." He leaned in closer, his eyes studying my face. "Ellison, why did you really come?" His question threw me off balance. I looked down, feeling my cheeks flush. "I don't know," I whispered. "Maybe because I have no one else to talk to." "And you think I can help?" His voice was soft, but there was a note of doubt in it. I nodded, not looking up. "Yes, I think so." Silence hung in the air, broken only by the crackling of the firewood. When he gently touched my hand, it felt both tender and inevitable. "You know we're on dangerous ground," he whispered, his gaze meeting mine. "I know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't matter." His hand remained on mine, and at that moment the distance between us disappeared. Our lips met in a kiss that felt like both liberation and a vow. The whole world beyond that moment dissolved, and I knew there was no turning back. Several days passed, but nothing changed. What happened between us seemed to hang in the air, an invisible web enveloping everything. I tried to avoid him, but it proved impossible. Even when I didn't see Mr. Graham, I felt his presence like a shadow following me. One morning, I heard a knock at the door. I froze, feeling my heart skip a beat. It was him. I opened the door, trying to hide my anxiety. "Good morning, Ellison," he said calmly, but there was tension in his voice. "Good morning," I replied, trying to sound steady. "Is something wrong?" "We need to talk," he said, lowering his gaze. "About what happened?" I nodded, letting him in. We sat in the living room, and the silence between us was deafening. I didn't know what to say, but he spoke first. "Ellison, I can't do this," he said, his voice hushed, looking at his hands as if expecting an answer from them. "What happened? It changes everything. For you, for me. I don't want to cause you pain." My heart tightened. His words were the truth I didn't want to hear but couldn't ignore. "I know," I whispered, "but I don't know what to do. I can't just go back to the way things were." He looked up, his eyes filled with pain. "You have to. This is wrong. You love your husband." His words cut me like a knife. I couldn't answer because I didn't know what I felt. Love, attachment, loneliness. It all blended into one, and I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "And you?" I asked, trying not to tremble. "What do you feel?" He was silent for a moment, then exhaled heavily. "I shouldn't have let this happen, but I can't pretend you mean nothing to me." My eyes filled with tears, and I turned away so he wouldn't see. His honesty only intensified the pain. "What should we do now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "We have to stop this," he said, standing up as if resolved at that moment. "I can't be the cause of your suffering, and you can't ruin your life because of me." He moved toward the door and I realized he was leaving. Forever. "Wait," I said, but he didn't turn around. He paused for a moment, as if he wanted to say something but didn't utter a word. A second later, the door closed behind him, leaving me in a silence that roared louder than any noise. At that moment, I realized that one chapter of my life had ended, but the wound from it would linger for a long time. The days after Mr. Graham's departure stretched into a silent wait. The silence in my house seemed louder than any noise, and the emptiness amplified every moment of doubt. I wandered from room to room like a ghost, unable to find my place. With each passing hour, each day, I became more aware that my life would never be the same. I tried to keep busy, return to my usual routine, make a shopping list, tidy up the garden. But each action reminded me of his words, his gaze. I began to think about what might have been if I had made a different choice, if I had stopped him at the door. On the fourth day, I decided to call my husband. It was a typical conversation filled with familiar phrases about how his business trip was going and how I was managing at home. But even over the phone, I could sense his distance. I wanted to tell him the truth, to share what was tormenting me, but the words stuck in my throat. "Ellison, is everything okay? You sound strange," he asked, his voice concerned but lacking warmth. "Yes, of course. Just a little tired," I replied. It was a lie, but it sounded plausible enough for him not to ask more questions. When the conversation ended, I felt relief, but also deep guilt. This lie became another stone in the heaviness that weighed on me. On the fifth day, I noticed Mr. Graham by the window of his house. He looked as calm as ever, but our eyes met for only a moment before he turned away. It felt like a blow. It seemed he had already started living his life, cutting me off like an unnecessary part. I couldn't take it anymore. That evening, I gathered my courage and approached his house. My steps on the wet path were slow but determined. I knocked on the door and my heart pounded wildly in my chest. Mr. Graham opened the door. He looked surprised but said nothing. Instead, he simply stepped aside, letting me in. His house seemed the same as always, cozy, filled with the soft light of lamps. But the atmosphere between us was heavy. "You came," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was caution in it. "I can't stay silent anymore," I replied. My voice trembled, but I didn't look away. "This is tormenting me, Mr. Graham. What happened? What we said to each other?" He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Ellison, we both knew this. Shouldn't have happened. I did what I thought was right, for both of us." "Right?" I interrupted. "This right is destroying me. You just left, as if nothing had happened, as if I meant nothing to you." He looked at me, and I saw pain in his eyes. It was unexpected. "You mean more to me than I can explain. But that's why I left. I don't want to be the cause of your pain, or your guilt." My eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let them fall. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. "Then why is this still here? Why does this feeling that I've lost something important not go away?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze wandered, as if he was searching for words that could fix everything but couldn't find them. Finally, he said, "Because we made a choice. But choices leave scars, Ellison, and some of them stay forever." I didn't know what to say. We stood in silence, and that silence spoke more than any words. I understood that he was right. Our connection, no matter how strong it was, had left traces that we both would carry. "I just want you to know," he continued, his voice softer, "that despite everything, I will never forget you. Never." Those words were both a comfort and a burden to me. I nodded, understanding that this was our last conversation and that now I had to let him go. As I left his house, the evening air felt colder than usual, but this time I felt like I was taking a step forward, even if it was difficult. My life wouldn't be the same, but now I knew. Ahead lay something new, something I would handle.